Good evening. Overnight we've had some interesting developments in Ukraine, starting with attacks by the Ukrainians using Storm Shadow or SCALP missiles on the Chongar and Henichesk bridges. If you just have a look here on the map, these bridges are the ones which connect Ukraine, the proper mainland of Ukraine, to Crimea. They make up the three main bridges connecting the Crimean landmass: the Kerch Bridge on the northeast, which has been recently attacked for the second time by the Ukrainians, and the Chongar and Henichesk bridges. The Chongar one has come under attack a number of times before. The reports of these attacks indicate that they were Storm Shadow missiles used. Now, this itself is interesting, as yesterday in the middle of Ukraine at Starokonstantinov, which I cannot pronounce this one, I need some work on that, in the Khmelnytsky region, there is an airfield which last night apparently undertook some direct strikes. There was initially thoughts that a large number of Tu-95 Tupolev bombers may have attacked this airfield. Today, some reporting indicates that those bombers may have primarily been attacking other targets. There were 15 of those bombers in the air yesterday, each of them carrying six cruise missiles, so 90 missiles in the air there. It appears, though, a couple of those were launched at the Starokonstantinov airbase. The importance of this airbase is that it is the airbase which is known to house the squadron of Su-24 fighters. Now, the Su-24s have been modified by the Ukrainian Air Force to allow them to carry Storm Shadow and SCALP missiles. Yesterday, there were some photographs of President Volodymyr Zelensky signing his best regards on the side of one of these SCALP missiles on an Su-24. So these attacks on the Chongar bridges, the Crimean bridges, a day after strikes on this airfield, may purely be coincidental, or they may be Ukraine trying to have a bit of a dig at Russia, and letting them know that even though they had attacked the airfield, they didn't get the Su-24s. Their thoughts that this is the case is based on the fact that apparently 12 Storm Shadow or SCALP missiles were fired in the attack on the bridges, 9 of them shot down and 3 of them apparently hitting. Now, there is some video evidence of an explosion at each of the bridges, and there is photographic evidence of the bridges being struck, and it does appear as though one of them, the Chongar Bridge, may have been hit by 2 missiles. One perhaps failing to explode properly or as expected on arrival. But anyhow, the Su-24s can carry 2 of these missiles each. So the reports of 12 of them being fired gives an indication that at least 6 of these Su-24s were airborne, were able to launch these strikes, and there are no reports of any Su-24s having been shot down. So they apparently have all completed their mission successfully. For the Russians, this will be something which will be somewhat annoying, given that they made an attack on the Su-24's home base. There have been some reports by some analysts that perhaps the Su-24s have been moved from that base. Prior to this attack, some even suggesting that the Su-24s may, because they are so crucial to the Ukrainian Air Force, because of their ability to launch Storm Shadow missiles, that they may even be being held outside of Ukraine in neighbouring nations' airfields and stored securely out of the way there. And then when required, may fly low level, undetected into Ukraine to the airfield, and once at the airfield, fuel up, load up with missiles, then launch from the airfield. So they are seen launching, coming up out of the airfield, make their attacks, return to that airfield, and then again later sneak away. Who can say if this is true or not? I think some of this speculation for them not being at the airfield may have come due to the fact that people felt that more of those Tupolev bombers may have been targeting that airfield, whereas some reports today seem to indicate that perhaps they weren't all targeting there and were in fact targeting other areas in Ukraine. But the Su-24s are very vital aircraft and seemingly playing whack-a-mole with the Russians at this stage. Now, other interesting news. We've got confirmation from a number of sources now that the Wagner forces are in Niger, and that they are there to protect the new leadership. Abdurrahmani Tiani, who is the military general who has assumed control of Niger after the recent coup d'etat. The disposed President Bazoum is still being held. He is communicating with the West, and the West is still communicating with him. There have been announcements from the new regime in Niger that they believe that ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States, have completed their preparations for military intervention in Niger, and that they are currently in a pre-deployment mode. In response to this, Niger has strengthened its reserves of forces on its borders with Nigeria and Benin. France, things are escalating in this area, obviously with Wagner forces in there. France has also announced that it is suspending aid to Burkina Faso. I should on the map here. We should just have a look at some of these areas here in Africa. So here we have Nigeria beneath it, and Burkina Faso is bordering on the west. Now, Burkina Faso and Mali have both indicated they will support Niger if any military intervention is made within Niger. Algeria, I believe, is also offering support there. Niger is, this isn't some conflict that is just going to go away by its own accord, and the reason is that Niger is very rich in uranium. Niger is a previous French colony. It obtained its independence from France in 1960, and France still holds control over much of the resources of Niger. So the prices that France pays to the Nigerian people and government for things like uranium and gold are ridiculously low in comparison to what they're able to sell these for. The uranium the French use importantly for the generation of electricity in France. So as France is moving towards a winter where the European nations do not have the ability to access, or at least not easily access, Russian gas and oil products. The importance of a secure access to Niger's uranium is vitally important for the French. Now, as I've mentioned before, the French have about 2,000 troops stationed in Niger. The Americans have about 1,500 troops at two bases. The new leadership in Niger has said to France and America that they need to be out of the country within 30 days. That's now probably down to about 27 days. This is presently being ignored by both nations, who are continuing to communicate with the ex-president Bazoum. So I expect that we will see some conflict in this area, particularly if Niger do stick to their guns and continue to stop the export of uranium and gold to France and to the US. There will be pressure put upon them, and this runs the real risk globally for us then of erupting into another conflict. A conflict which the Russians will have an interest in. I wouldn't say that this is an extension of the Ukraine conflict directly. It has related parties, with Wagner being in there. Now, Wagner is a PMC. They're a private military company. So, in theory, Yevgeny Prigozhin can sell their services to whoever he chooses to. However, they do receive strong backing. Were originally formed out of the Ministry of Defense in Russia. Russia has ultimate control over them in what they do. If they wish to continue to operate in Europe and receive contracts from Russia, so they will have an interest here. The Russians have a strong interest in Africa also, just due to the changing world order, with the BRICS grouping growing in strength and popularity, with the recent African summit held in Russia, where President Putin has spoken to a number of delegates from African countries. Those talks seem to have gone very well, been very positive. President Putin's speeches, presence and gestures have been well received by the African nations. Now, while we have people like Burrell from the EU making speeches to the African nations that if they accept Putin's offer of free grain, they are giving away their independence. This is contrasted by the fact that Putin has offered to provide free grain to the African nations to make up for Ukrainian grain that can't be supplied because of the end of the Black Sea grain deal. And also, there is a large amount of Russian grain allegedly sitting in ports, which are being held up and not delivered to Africa due to the sanctions imposed upon the transfer and delivery and acceptance of Russian goods. So Russia is very keen to see a lifting of sanctions related to Russia's export of food stocks and fertilizer products to nations. For multiple reasons. Obviously, it's a revenue income for them, but also they are able to then continue to provide aid to those nations. At this stage, they're unable to because their products are being sanctioned and not allowed into many of these countries. The West has an interest here. Obviously, France. France is not the only nation which uses the uranium for electricity production from Niger. All of Europe is running the risk of troubles with their energy dependency, because Europe is a large developed area of the world. It has high energy supplies, and there is some pretty tight connection between any graph showing a nation's development and the consumption of energy. As development, productivity, and lifestyle goes up, so does the consumption of energy within a country. Threats to energy of European nations are real threats, which can become existential threats for those nations. So if this goes on, we will see France being pressured into making a decision. How does it resolve this issue? Now, it's invested quite a bit of its military capability in the Ukrainian conflict, perhaps leaving it depleted in its stocks and reserves, much like many of the other nations. So the French have a real dilemma on their hands here. Do they continue to support the conflict in Ukraine when they are relatively distant from it? Or do they pivot and now need to send forces perhaps to Niger, Algeria, Burkina Faso and Mali to try to regain control over the uranium which they are dependent upon? This will be a very interesting area of geopolitical news in the coming months. Just moving on a little bit to the battlefront update in Ukraine over the last 24 hours. In the Bakhmut area, just get this up on the map here. So in Bakhmut here, where there has been serious fighting going on now since the end of last year, the area just to the southwest of Bakhmut, Klishchiivka, this area here on the map, there has been heavy fighting here for the last 2 months during the Ukrainian offensive, as the Ukrainians have attempted to capture this area of Klishchiivka and then gain access to the railroad which is to the north of it. Now, this railway isn't supplying Bakhmut, or Artyomsk, as the Russians refer to Bakhmut. This railway line isn't supplying Bakhmut. Bakhmut and Artyomsk is supplied from the east. However, if Klishchiivka is taken, it strengthens the Ukrainian line here, and access to the railway would provide some level of cover for advancing north into the southern side of Artyomsk. There are reports that there is another push. The Ukrainians are organising another push in Klishchiivka, with Russian reports of 9 Ukrainian battalions reported grouping in this area. And interestingly, in Chasov Yar, here to the west of Artyomsk and Klishchiivka, an interesting report of a new air defense systems and some unidentified radar around this area. In this area around here, there have been some reports, interesting reports of in the southern Donetsk and so Zaporozhye regions of an area of no Ukrainian drone usage. Now, this is interesting, and reportedly what may have been happening in this area is that the Russians have been trialing some of their new electronic warfare capabilities. So these are units which are deployed and are able to interfere with electronic communications. There have been some reports recently of some Ukrainian commanders complaining that after tens of meters, after 60 or 70 meters, their field radios no longer work. They can't communicate with their soldiers using them. They can see them and use hand signals, but they can't communicate over electronic means due to Russian electronic warfare. Now, many of the drones that we hear of being knocked out in these attacks on Moscow, which have been happening relatively frequently now, where drones have been sent from Ukraine to Moscow, these are also many of the drones that are disabled aren't disabled by air defense interceptor missiles, but instead are disabled via electronic warfare countermeasures. So interesting that there is a zone along here where reportedly there have been no Ukrainian reports of successful drone strikes on the Russians, but as you move north and as you move west of the area, there are reports of the drone strikes. So it does appear that the Russians are working on electronic warfare measures. There was talk that came out last week also that they may even have the capabilities now to disable Starlink systems. So the Ukrainians rely heavily on Starlink throughout Ukraine for their communications. The Starlink system, which is developed by Elon Musk, works with an array of satellites flying over the Earth. These satellites are spread out. There's hundreds, if not thousands of them now in the sky, and they provide global coverage. So this means that in an area where your normal telecommunications, those things that are that consist of large backbone of either microwave repeaters set up on hilltops or actual fiber running through the ground and over lines carrying them across the country, where these have been disabled or damaged or power has been taken out so they're not able to operate, Starlink provides a means of communication via internet. So this will be a major advance if the Russian military is able to disable or suppress Starlink capability within a region for the troops, because it is their primary means of communication, internet communication, while fighting. Moving down to the southern Donetsk area, around Staromayorsk and Urozhny. In these areas here, Staromayorsk, around here, this is the area where the Ukrainians have made some advance. They have worked their way down this Vrememka ledge, following this pathway, this road down through here, and this river down through here, through Neskuchne, Makrivka, and now Staromayorsk and Urozhny. The Russians are reporting that the Denis Pushilin, who's the head of the DPR, has stated that Ukraine is sending reinforcements to these areas here. And then if we go further this way to Orkiv and Robotny here in Zaporozhye, continued attacks on Zaporozhye. It appears, though, the Ukrainians are reinforcing and attacking all across the line, even in the north, in the area from Kupiansk down to Liman and the Kremenia forest area down here, where we spoke yesterday of this 90-kilometer front along here where the Russians have been slowly advancing westward. It seems that today the Russians are consolidating their positions and the Ukrainians are making counteroffensives. So all across the line there seems to be a general push from the Ukrainians and strong resistance from the Russians. Now, the last 2 months have been incredibly costly for the Ukrainians in terms of material lost and in terms of men lost, killed and wounded. The estimates of the numbers here are very high, well over 20,000 Ukrainian losses in men per month. Getting towards mid-August now, start of August, end of the first week of August, numbers in the range of 45,000 lost for the Ukrainians are being reported from a number of sources. Now, all of this effort in the last 2 months appears to have, on this image here that I found on Twitter, have resulted in Ukraine capturing these areas in dark blue. Now, as you can see, these are not large areas compared to the area which is currently under Russian control. And in this same period of time of what was loudly touted as being the Ukrainian offensive, the big summer offensive, during this period of time in the north, in this area from Kupiansk, we see these areas in yellow here as areas where the Russian forces have made ground, and in fact, even more than just these yellow areas have been achieved by the Russians over the previous couple of months. So, on a net basis, we may see that the Russians have actually claimed more territory in the last 7 or 8 weeks than the Ukrainians have, even though this was supposedly a Ukrainian offensive. On the backdrop of this, and if we think about what is coming, we have the Russian mobilization to consider. There are growing reports that there are large numbers of Russian reservists and volunteers joining and signing contracts. Dmitry Medvedev has stated that since the 1st of January until the 1st of August this year, 2023, that 231,000 men have signed contracts with the Ministry of Defense. Now some of those will be ex-soldiers who have rolled out of contract and are renewing a contract. Some will be reservists who have had some level of previous military training. Some will be brand new volunteers. But given that started in January, some of them now will have completed 6 months of good training and will be coming ready. And over the next 6 months, taking us up until December and January and deep into the winter in Ukraine, then the remainder of those will come on. And by a number of Russian reports, so take them with the skepticism you think is deserved, the Russian Ministry of Defense is receiving over 10,000 volunteers per month, without even forced mobilization, without the recruitment drives that they do twice a year for young men who have to undergo their 1 year of military service. So Russia, a country of 140 million people, is starting to slowly draw upon those and build a formidable force. As I say, we look at the last 2 months of the Ukrainian offensive. The Russians have held ground, have lost a tiny bit of territory in the southern regions, have gained that much in the northern regions. The Russians appear to have enough resources to be able to hold the Ukrainian line. With the influx that may come from 200,000 more soldiers, the coming months may see Russia, once the ground freezes again in December, may see them wish to launch their own winter offensive. Now, the key difference here, while the two forces seem to perhaps be balanced on the current front line, is that this fighting is happening in Ukraine. Every meter lost is a meter of Ukraine lost to the Russians. So Russian morale is high, whereas Ukraine morale is dropping as they lose land. The Russian forces are supported by Russia and supply lines that are relatively secure. There are some strikes. There are the occasional reports of, say, a Russian ammunition dump being struck. There were a few of those a fortnight ago in Crimea. There have been some targets hit in Crimea over the last 2 weeks, but these are small in scale compared to the almost daily constant damage being done to the Ukrainian supply lines, the Ukrainian ability to manufacture and repair equipment, the electricity infrastructure, with nightly missile and drone strikes being launched by the Russians and deep into Ukraine too, not just behind the front lines at the ammunition dumps there, but right across to the west near Lviv in the far west of Ukraine. There have been strikes there. So this puts Ukraine under a great deal of pressure to try to repel any future Russian offensive or advance. And just today, I saw reports of the Ukrainian President Zelensky talking about a full Ukrainian mobilization, talking about how they would find more people to join the fighting. And as I mentioned yesterday in what I felt was a slightly distressing article, Ukrainian military sources talking about their preparations to develop women's uniforms, women's body armor and protective equipment for women, which has been based upon feedback from women on the front lines. This article coming out just before Zelensky talking about a larger full mobilization and the need for Ukrainians to commit to the integrity of their country gives me the impression that they are starting to become desperate and are struggling to find resources and are looking to reach out and include more women in this. This is a terrible, terrible situation. We've got to remember that Ukraine started this conflict with 40 million people, but has already lost a number of somewhere like 11 million people to an exodus from the country. Reportedly, about 3 million went east to Russia and 7 million went west to Western nations. So there's 10 or more million left there. Then there are reports of up to at least 200,000 and up to 300,000 casualties for the Ukrainians. And in this case, these reports are talking about loss of life, people killed, 200,000 or 300,000. As I mentioned in my video yesterday, I did a little bit of a breakdown on this. These numbers become quite frightening when you realize that those 200 to 300,000 will predominantly be men, and will predominantly be men between the ages of 18 and 45, the fighting age. So when you start to break those demographics down, I think you're ending up with numbers of like 1 in every 150 men in that age group killed in this conflict. And remember, there was a month ago some reporting from the Kiev Institute of Statistics which talked specifically about this, where at that stage they were reporting numbers of nearly 80% of the Ukrainians interviewed knew someone, close friend or family, who had been killed in this conflict. And I think the average number, when they talked to one of these 80% of people who knew someone close, family or friends who had been killed, the average number of people that they knew that had been killed was 3. So these numbers are terrible. The Ukrainian nation, even if the fighting were to stop today, it will be decades before the country recovers. You also have to remember that many of these people who have left won't return. Some of the 7 million who have left were from eastern Ukraine, which is now going to become Russian territory, and they won't feel comfortable returning there. Some of the people just won't return because they'll find a better life in other nations than they will in returning to a war-devastated Ukraine. The outlook, beyond just the pure military outlook, the actual economic and existential outlook for Ukraine in the coming years is poor, I think, to say the least. There have been peace talks, the Jeddah peace talks. These are the second in a series of summits. The first was in Copenhagen in June. Neither of these have resulted in anything tangible for the West or tangible in terms of peace. The Jeddah summit, hosted by Saudi Arabia this weekend, attended by about 40 nations. Some major ones didn't attend and were very open about the reason why, and that was because Russia wasn't invited. So while this may have been a way perhaps for Saudi Arabia to position themselves as a powerful negotiator, looking to gain themselves some points on the global stage as being seen to want to negotiate peace, this is a powerful role in global relationships. We saw that President Erdogan of Turkey received great acclaim for having brokered the Black Sea grain deal between Ukraine and Russia. In a similar way, if someone were to be seen to be the broker of peace, that would be very powerful for that nation or that leader. However, without Russia there, this, whatever it isn't a peace summit. The real parties that will negotiate peace when it comes time to do that will be Russia and the United States. Whatever front may be placed upon that, whoever may lead the Ukrainian delegation in those talks will be there as a figurehead and will be really in the background to the true negotiations going on between the larger powers of the US and Russia. There was an article which came out. This is from a Ukrainian article from their legislature, that stating that they believe that the US are now looking for a different person to lead those talks. So when it becomes time to negotiate, that it wouldn't be Volodymyr Zelensky leading those negotiation talks. It would be someone else, someone with no track record or allegations of corruption, yet someone who they could see in a presidential role. So this is one of the things that we will see when it does get to negotiation time. There will be, one of the items on the negotiating table will be who will lead and form the government that will lead the remainder or the western area of Ukraine. Whoever it may be, one of the Russian requirements, I'm sure, will be that that person is Russian friendly. The Russians will probably want some level of influence over that government, because they will want to ensure that the west of Ukraine, and when I say the west, I mean the area to the west of the Dnieper and the area above Odessa, because I believe that areas to the east of the Dnieper and the Odessa and Crimean regions will ultimately fall under Russian control as part of this when this campaign concludes. So the Russians will want that western region to remain a neutral region, and for the leadership of that area to commit to not joining NATO. So that, I think, will come for Ukraine in the next. You will start to see this shaping up over the coming months. Right now, we seem to have been after a big night of missile attacks to be perhaps approaching one of those lulls that we get again from time to time, where things seem to slow down for a little bit. Part of this may be weather-induced. When there's rain, things tend to slow down. We have a few weeks until the Raspinista, the wet season or the mud season, will occur when the autumn rains happen. That will slow fighting down for a period of time. But then after that, when the weather gets cold and the ground freezes, so this may be in December, we may expect December, perhaps January, even later, we may then expect to see some form of a Russian advance, depending upon the shape that Ukraine is in at that stage. At some point, Russia will be making a calculation about 2024 and what they want to do there. Do they want to try to finish this quickly, which I imagine they probably do, in which case we would expect that in early 2024 that there will be a mobilization, or beforehand, the mobilization may even occur soon to prepare for an early 2024 advance to try to take Odessa and get to the Dnieper. Do they want to look to time that successful activity to have the most impact against Joe Biden and his re-election chances in November of 2024? And will they be considering Putin's own re-election in March of 2024? Now, Putin appears to be on fairly firm ground at this stage, with all of the reported approval polls having him polling very high in the 70%, as opposed to Joe Biden, who's polling very low, poorly in the 30s. Putin has to consider the fact that if he does make a mobilization of 500,000 men, that if they believe him and support him and he does that, then great. He could do that at any time. If he has concerns that 500,000 men being mobilized may not be happy about that, then he may leave that until after March, which means we would then probably see right around, I imagine, October. The October surprise for Joe Biden this in 2024 may well be that Ukraine capitulates at that time and he goes into the November election wearing the loss of Ukraine around his neck. So interesting to see. Just in terms of the US a little more, there are reports overnight that a flotilla of Chinese and Russian ships travelled up near the Aleutian Islands near Alaska, and that the Americans dispatched their own grouping of 4 US Navy destroyers and a P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft have been dispatched to the location of the flotilla. The Russian and Chinese flotilla did not enter US territory, a US defense official told the US Naval Institute News. Now, what is interesting, which this surprises me, that a lot of people forget just how close Russia and the United States are. And my camera is being painful and not focusing again tonight. A lot of people, I think, tend to look at this traditional map of the world. Oh, let me get this on the screen. Here you go. This traditional map of the world, where if we measure the distance, let's say, from this eastern tip of America around here somewhere, across to Russia here, it's about 6.5, maybe more, 6,500 kilometers. That's a long way between America and Russia. However, a lot of people forget that Alaska is part of the United States, and Alaska is here, and Russia is here. And if we zoom in, it is about 80 kilometers from the easternmost tip of Russia to the westernmost tip of Alaska. Now, Alaska became the 49th state of the United States on the 3rd of January 1959. So there's that gap there of 80 kilometers between the two. Now, this isn't where these boats, these Chinese and Russian boats were. They were down a little south in the Bering, along here. They were traveling around the Aleutian Islands around here and keeping to their own waters, but getting close enough that the Americans felt the need to send out 4 destroyers, and an aircraft just to keep an eye on what's going on. So, we are seeing more and more in the news of these combined Russian and Chinese naval exercises. The Russian Navy has last month been to China, were welcomed with open arms. Apparently, their naval exercises went very well. Now, while China has stayed out of the Ukraine conflict, there's been some reporting of some logistics support in terms of contracts for this mobilized Russian army for armor and helmets being supplied by China. But in terms of weaponry, there doesn't appear to have been any great deal of direct support from China. There are some reports of drones having been provided. However, I believe that many of these drones provided by China are of the much smaller FPV variety. But we do see this closeness with the two navies. And again, this is something to be considered. At this stage, I think all of us have taken a very, but we've taken a relatively focused look at things where we've focused on Ukraine and Russia and what is happening here. However, if things, let's just say, did progress to where NATO became involved in the conflict and suddenly Russia was now under threat from NATO, well, more likely than not, if China were to enter that dispute to support someone, they would support Russia. That brings a whole different calculus to the game. If China, its Navy, its forces, its Air Force, then move westward across Russia. Russia would, I'm sure, allow them to do so, to join the conflict as needed. Look, who knows? It may or may not come, but the next few months, the next 6 months, the next 12 months, whenever this conflict reaches that point where it is either negotiation or it is NATO intervention, we will see, in either case, very large changes to the current world geopolitical order. Okay, that's, I think, enough for tonight. Thank you very much. If you've watched this far, I really appreciate you watching the show. I hope you're enjoying the channel. Please leave a comment. If you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.